Why pastors convert to Catholicism while innocent Roman Catholics leave it? Deceive? Welcome again to Faithful Believer. If you're not faithful, you're not a perfectly believer. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so for me.
Don't you know that many Protestant pastors and strong critics of the Catholic Church eventually convert to Catholicism without ever being preached to by Catholics?
They didn't convert because of emotion. They converted because of truth.
They do not ignore history. They studied the early church fathers, the councils, and the unbroken line of apostolic succession. They saw that the Catholic Church didn't just appear, it endured. They do not ignore that Christ founded the Catholic Church. Not Luther, not Calvin, not Zwingli. They do not ignore the truth anymore. The Bible they hold, the word they proclaim, it came through the Catholic Church. Councils, martyrs, monks, centuries of discernment. They used to preach against the church, but now they know. Ignorance is often chosen. They didn't know because they didn't want to know, and when the truth became undeniable, they could no longer ignore it.
You want testimonies? Here are a few. Former critics, former pastors, now defenders of the church they once opposed.
My name is David Tews. I live in Indiana and I have a little story I'd like to share today about how I entered into the Catholic Church. I was not born Catholic. In fact, was born very Lutheran, from a very strong Lutheran family. My dad is one of the most faithful Christians I know on earth. He prayed with us every night and read scriptures to us. So I certainly grew up knowing Jesus Christ as my Savior and loving Him and loving family. It was a wonderful upbringing. But I went to school to become an engineer and was going to take an extra year to finish that after 4 years, and my parents probably wisely pulled the financial plug. And so I joined the Marine Corps in order to pay for the rest of my school. This would have been in the year 2000. So while I was I was actually overseas when September 11th happened. I was in Kosovo at the time. And we came back, and then we were sent overseas then to be part of the initial invasion force in Iraq. It was during that time that I kept feeling this feeling that I was supposed to become a pastor. It was not something that I had considered before, so I asked God for some kind of sign, because that would have been such a big change from what my intention had been to go and finish my engineering degree. So when I returned home, I obviously greeted my wife with great joy. We were very happy to be back together. But in one of our first conversations, she said, Daniel, I was thinking, I had this feeling that you're supposed to be a pastor. I thought, wow, that's amazing. Okay, there's my sign, God, I'll go. And well, then I called my parents, and they of course were happy to hear I'm home safely. And my dad, in that first conversation, said, Daniel, I have this feeling that you're supposed to be a pastor. I said, oh, well, there it is, God. And well, I've got two younger sisters. Of the two, one of them said the same thing. And they said they had not talked with each other during this time, that it was just that they all said that same thing. So I thought, well, there's my sign. And so I finished my degree. I went to the Lutheran seminary. It was a 4-year program there. And after that, I was ordained as a pastor and sent to my first call, which was in rural South Dakota. Just absolutely beautiful country, the wonderful people up there, and I absolutely loved it. Just becoming a pastor and teaching Bible studies and studying the scriptures, all those things that I love to do. One of my good friends from the seminary had a call to Minnesota, and we would talk on the phone often, weekly or every other week, just about things in the ministry or family, whatnot. And one day he told a funny story. It was sad. It was his father had been ill for a long time, passed away. But the day before the funeral, he met the pastor at the viewing, and that was going to do his father's funeral. And he was some non-denominational or Baptist background, was what his father was at the time. And so he talked to him, and my friend told him that he was a Lutheran pastor, and that everything was fine. Well, my friend was surprised to hear during the sermon, during the funeral, the pastor looked down at him and start pounding in the pulpit and saying, "There are some people who believe that in order to become a pastor, you have to go to school." you have to learn languages and teachings. He then goes on to explain how he had been a lay person, and then the Holy Spirit told him, and the next day he was a pastor. When my friend told me that story, it just seems like a small story, but it had such big implications to me because I recognized immediately that something was wrong with that. I knew at the seminary how much I had learned, how much I had grown and formed myself as a teacher and understander of scriptures and the teachings. And I knew that if I didn't have that, I would not have been as effective as I was. And so I thought, well, what better way to prove that Lutheranism is what it should be and that this is how we're supposed to be teaching our people is to go to the very sources. Even Martin Luther had the great thing, you always say, go back to the sources, go back to the font of knowledge. And so I thought, well, that's a very Lutheran idea, so I'm going to do that. So I started with the Didache and started reading through that. Now, it was nothing profound, but immediately I came to a recognition that what I was reading there just didn't sound very Lutheran. In fact, there may have been some things in the Didache. So this is written by the people who were literally taught by the apostles themselves. The next thing that was written after the New Testament was completed, that if I said them in front of a Lutheran congregation, I might get in trouble. But it wasn't much, and so I kept going and started going through Tertullian and many of the early church fathers up through and kept going all the way to St. Augustine. And as I was reading through these more and more and more, there became a growing and growing recognition that what I was reading was by no means Lutheran. In fact, it sounded very, very Catholic. Now, what my understanding of the Catholic Church had been up until that time was just a caricature of what the Lutheran Church taught that the Catholic Church taught. And so there was some of the common mistakes that people believe about the Catholic Church, that they worship Mary, or that whatever the Pope says at any given time is perfectly true, and we have to do all these things. And so I decided to actually purchase a Catholic catechism and started reading through that. So again, this is I dedicated my first half of the day to just, still reading scriptures, time in prayer, and now was studying the early church fathers. And instead of reading the Book of Concord and the small catechism of Luther, I just started reading the Catholic catechism just to see what it was that the Catholic Church taught. And I still have this catechism to this day, and I still read it a lot. And I love doing this because I go back. At the time, I was highlighting in red all those things that, see, this is bad. This is what the Catholic Church teaches that is against what we know of, from Scripture. And so these were in there. So to this day, I still go back and I kind of smile, and I thought, hey, it's such a beautiful passage now. But at the time, because that conflicted with my Lutheran understanding of things, I highlighted it red. And so I still like those passages when I come across them today. But there was something about the Catholic Catechism that I really liked. The Lutheran Catechism is very short, and it kind of just covers the basics about the Lord's Prayer, about communion, baptism, things like that. It's very short. But the Catholic Catechism has everything in it. If you haven't read the Catholic Catechism of the Catholic Church, I strongly encourage it. It's a beautiful work, and it covers everything. Not only the things about theology, about Christ, about the church, but there's huge portions about how we should even live together as community, even as nations. It kind of says that if we are who we are as followers of Christ, it actually affects how we live together in our nations, how we act as a people together. And so it's a wonderful work in that sense. So for me, I really, that drew me in very strongly at that time. And that was really meaningful to me. So as I continued to study the church fathers, I kept coming to a realization that there were some pretty significant differences between what I was taught as a Lutheran and what I was teaching to my people as a pastor, and with what the early church was saying themselves. And it started me to wonder how the Lutherans came to the conclusions that they did, especially when they directly contradicted things in the early church fathers. And one of the things that came very early to me was a question of mine is, who was Luther? What was Luther? What was his role? And if he had a certain role in the church, how did he get that role? Because it became to the point that inside the Lutheran documents, if there was a place that Luther contradicted, say, what St. Augustine said, the Lutheran church would go with what Luther said. If Luther contradicted something that Tertullian said, they would go with what Luther said. Or every one of the church fathers, they would always go back to what Luther said, even if it was in direct contradiction to the teachings of the church, the historical faith that was believed at all times and in all places, at least amongst Christendom. And so I asked myself the question, what was Luther? What was he? He railed against the Pope and how that idea of a papal office was not scriptural, that it was used for great evil. And yet, what Luther was taking on him for himself, as far as an authority to be a teaching authority of the church, was far greater than I realized that the Pope ever had for himself. He was able, on his own, to knock down the number of sacraments in the church to just baptism and the Lord's Supper, knocking out all the other ones on his own. He was able to, on his own, change the number of books in the Bible. I mean, taking out all of what I always understood, the Catholic books of the Bible, but then in my realization through the Septuagint that they were there, and at least the Bible that Jesus would have quoted from, the Old Testament scriptures that Jesus would have quoted from, had the other books of the Catholic Church in them. And so what gave him the authority to make such sweeping changes within the church? And yet that was an authority that he was not willing to grant to the one that was actually given the keys that was passed down from St. Peter through the popes up to his day. And so that became a very difficult question for me. And I started then reaching out to some of my other pastor friends and asking them that question. And the general Lutheran answer to that is that he's kind of another church father, or he was just very intelligent, or that he knew his Bible so well that he was able to do these things, up to and including that there's some that would say that he is a prophet that's kind of pointed out in the book of Revelation. And so not many people go that route, but there's quite a few different options for that. But especially the idea that he was a church father, that's kind of what it came up to. But if that was the case still, why would he be able to contradict other church fathers and have that teaching authority over them? However, for what he was taking, he was a kind of a super pope in what he was. So that was something that was really leading me along in trying to find out why Lutheran doctrine was so in contradiction to what was taught in the early church. At that time, I was really having more and more of a fascination with the Catholic Church based on what I had been reading in the Catechism. And I was going to some different Catholic blogs at the time as well, just trying to learn more and more what the Catholic Church taught. And so there definitely was an interest growing in my mind, that combined with what I was reading in the Church Fathers. But it was during that time that a pretty significant thing happened, and that was I found out about the Rosary. I mean, I wouldn't say I found out about it. Most Protestants know there is such a thing as a rosary, and we had seen them before, but I hadn't really given it much thought. But one of the things that I liked to do during that time, in my time of prayer, is I would, oftentimes my office was right next to it, I would go into the church and I liked to kneel and do my prayers there, which is very peaceful. Now, obviously, the Lutherans don't have the body of Christ there in a tabernacle or of anything of that nature, but it still was just a peaceful place for me to go and pray. But sometimes it was as we often do, we have difficulty with our minds wandering. And I always wanted something that I could just, kind of keep track of where I was, in a sense, prayer beads of something like that. And so as long as I was already kind of dabbling and reading in different things of the Catholic Church, I thought I would try a rosary. So I received my first rosary actually from my wife, which is a kind of a story on its own. She's having a parallel story at the same time that I'd like to touch on as well. But I printed out just a sheet from the internet about how to pray a rosary, and I had that sheet in front of me and started going through it. Now, from a Lutheran perspective, there's some little difficulties. At least the Hail Mary, the first half of it, I think any Lutheran or Protestant can pray no problem. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. All of that is purely from the Bible. We're hearing it from, where St. Elizabeth, Our Lady visits St. Elizabeth, from the angel's greeting to Mary, no problem. But it's the second half of it where we're actually asking Mary for her intercession that, a Lutheran for so long is taught that we only pray to Jesus. And that was a difficult thing to do. And so just to ask for intercession, that second half was. But I went ahead and tried it anyway, and went through, and it was difficult, but made it through. And I actually started doing that as a daily habit almost immediately. It was very became very important to me. And as I continued my journey through this, and that rosary was kind of always alongside of me, and I began praying it every day and asking for wisdom, especially if I had anything that I was asking for, it was show me the truth, and lead me to where that I'm supposed to be, because I loved being a pastor. I loved what I did. I loved the time in prayer and study, and I couldn't imagine doing anything else. But I wanted to follow the truth, and was becoming more and more convinced as I was going through this, that there may be some serious issues with remaining in the pastoral ministry. At one point in time, even, I sat down with my father, the strong Lutheran, strong Christian, man of God, love him dearly, and I told him some of the problems that I was having. And he said, Lent's coming up. During this time, why don't you try stopping everything Catholic? Stop praying the rosary, stop reading anything Catholic, stop reading the church fathers, just go back to what you know. Maybe you're just getting too overwhelmed with one side of things. And so I thought, that was a good idea, a good suggestion. And so I did that. Even stopped praying the rosary. There was something really fascinating happened. I had this just constant feeling in my mind, this constant pull back to the rosary. I didn't pray it, but it never stopped. It was like Our Lady was just pulling me back into this, and it was very interesting, and that was very telling to me. And so after Lent was over, I really, jumped back both feet into it. The fact that I could not go those 40 days without praying that rosary was really cool, and I think that was just something that was really convincing me that where I was going was the right place to be. I got to change gears a little bit too, because I think there was something very fascinating happening at the same time. So I'm in my office, I'm going through all of these things, and my wife, I didn't know how she would respond to what I was learning. So I started perhaps just dropping some little hints and some things like that, and occasionally to get something, that's a little weird for a Lutheran pastor to say, but okay, but she really wasn't real open to it. So I was very careful. I didn't want to unload, because I had spent months, and at this time years even, studying, and that was what was bringing me to this other side. But all this time, my wife was having her own, she didn't know it at the time, but conversion experience as well. She was invited by a friend of hers to be a part of a women's group, and they read works of classic literature. So each month they would have a different book. They would read this book, anything from Dostoevsky to Wendell Berry. There was just a whole bunch of really neat books that I loved. I'm a huge reader, and so I thought that was really neat. And so she got to go with them once a month. Then they would meet. And the neat thing about this was, all the other people in the group, all the other ladies were Catholic, and but this was one of just reading classic literature, so there was nothing particularly threatening about that. And so once a month when we got together at one of the ladies' houses, she lived out in the country at a beautiful farmhouse. She had, I believe, 7 kids. There was another woman there that had 8 children, another that had 6, 2 more that had 5, and one that her friend only had 3. But it was funny, amongst that group, we, who with our 5 children, had one of the smaller families in it. But it was really cool because all the dads would serve lunch and watch all these kids, and that gave the moms some time to go in a back room, and they would discuss the book they would read, and they would spend, as they will often do, some of the time talking about the book, and much of the time talking about being a mother and a wife and homeschooling and all that, things like that. So, but she loved this group. And she told me later that one of the things that struck her was about how all of these women, lay women, were showing signs of the faith that she had never seen amongst the Protestant side of things, not in the Lutheran church, not anywhere else. Every room of their house had some sort of religious icon, or a crucifix, or a picture of Our Lady, or a saint, every room. And she realized at our house, we had, of course had a Bible in the living room, and I think we probably had a cross somewhere else, but it wasn't nearly to that level. The way that these women, she said, were able to just bring the faith into everything that they did, their teaching, their speech, their how they went about their lives, she was so impressed. She hadn't really said that, but later on, as I was going further in my journey and I started to share with Shayna, I think that the Catholic Church is the true church. It's the church that was started by Christ. It's the church that was there from the beginning, and started sharing these things with her. She was obviously resistant at first, since just because my livelihood and our home and everything that we loved was tied up in this Lutheran identity. But she at the same time said that these women that she had been spending so much time with, and they were becoming such close friends, were such a powerful witness to her that she was seeing that there was something about the Catholic Church that was drawing her as well. So actually, it was her that at this time, then after some of these discussions, we were having many discussions about it, that she actually bought my first rosary for me that I was using in my office. And so she was coming along, and as we discussed more and more things, and I would show some of the problems theologically with what the Lutheran Church taught and how that compared to what the Catholic Church taught. Some of the things that we believed that the Catholic Church was actually teaching, and how the Catechism said, no, this is actually what it is. It's a much more nuanced understanding, or completely different than what the Protestants thought the Catholics taught. As those things came on, she became more and more understanding of the truth of the Catholic Church, and she became very enthusiastic about it. And we started even sharing it with our Catholic friends, and they were very encouraging about it, and very helpful. There came a time then that there was a period of suffering in this, as we both knew what we believed that Jesus and our Blessed Mother were leading us to do, where this path of trying to follow the truth, trying to follow the history of the teachings of the Church, which was unbroken from the time of Christ up until now, in the Catholic Church, but with such an overlay of something totally foreign to it in the Protestant side. This period of suffering, really, we defined it as trying to keep one foot in both camps. I was trying to be very faithful to what I had pledged as a Lutheran pastor to teach Lutheran theology. So in my Bible studies, in my sermons and things like that, I was still teaching faithfully what the Lutheran Church taught. I was not trying to be a crypto-Catholic in this and try to do anything of that nature, because I believed that would go against what I had pledged to do and would have been not fair to the people in my congregation. But at the same time, I was studying so much behind the scenes in this. I think there were some good opportunities during that time to correct wrong teachings about the Catholic Church in those Bible studies and in different conversations with various Lutherans. So I think that was helpful, but it was still very difficult to try to live both sides. So we knew that at some point in time, we were going to need to make a decision. What I decided to do was approach, especially 4 of my very close pastoral friends, good theologians, all of them in the Lutheran Church, and a couple more that I didn't see as often. But I approached all of these men with what I had found, and I asked them, "Look, I don't want to be right. Please find a place where you can say, 'No, Daniel, here it is. You're wrong. This is what it actually is,' and I could just go back to doing what I love to do." So we would discuss at great lengths our different understandings, and I really posed them 2 big questions that stood out. One was, who was Luther? What was Luther? What was his role? What gave him that teaching authority? I really came to the conclusion that Luther was a super pope, that he was able to, by himself, change teachings of the church, and he always claimed that he went back to the early church, and that was not true, and I showed that. And in many cases, I showed where the Lutheran fathers were misquoting very intentionally the church fathers over and over, taking things out of context, and so that was one of my big arguments. The other question that I came to my Lutheran friends about is actually probably the number one reason I'm a Catholic. People have asked before if there was just one single reason, and for me it is the the existence of the office of the papacy. And if it wasn't Luther, what I also realized is that somebody has to become that ultimate arbiter of what is in and what is out. Probably, if we're honest, most people, that line runs through themselves. They are their own pope. But for others, it might be Luther, it might be Calvin or Zwingli or one of the other Protestant fathers, or in many non-denominational congregations, it changes when they get a new pastor. And without a pope, it is complete and utter chaos. There are, depending on how they're counted, between 20 and 30,000 different denominations. There's over 6,000 Lutheran denominations alone. And this understanding, going back to that original thing that made me think about my friend at his father's funeral, where the pastor got up and said that people think you need to go to school in order to be a pastor, when all you need is the leadings of the Holy Spirit to get up and preach. This chaos, this every person being their own arbiter of truth, I knew was a problem. And so the Catholic Church, they also, obviously we have a pope, but this pope was instituted by Christ, and it's an unbroken line over the 2,000 years since then that we still have the same pope. And so this is the one thing, if anything else, is why I believe I'm a Catholic. It's because I can know without a doubt that I'm within this visible church on earth, that those who are following Christ, following Our Lady, ultimately just knowing that we're inside the authority of the church, and that when huge questions of doctrine come and go, there is somebody that says, this is the way that it is. Between the church and the councils, it is kept the truth, and we can know what it is the truth. If you're Protestant, and what I was doing at the time is you have to constantly weigh every single bit of theology and try to determine, looking at scripture, looking at other things, is this the right one or is this the right one? And it's tiresome. I went to my friends with these questions. Ultimately, they admitted they did not have answers to them. And they, even after I left and became Catholic, they still continued to meet from time to time and even invited other ones in. I know at least one of them now also is Catholic. But at least I wanted to bring them these questions. And other of them thanked me just to say that they were better able to articulate their own faith at the time. So, and I'm glad about that. I told them, don't mischaracterize what the Catholic Church teaches. If you are going to believe that, still since the 16th century, when Luther said we need to split with the Catholic Church, if you still have that reason for split for another year, go ahead. But every year, ask yourself, do we still have enough that is separating the church that we should continue protesting? If not, come back. And so every year I encourage them to ask themselves that. And so at least one of them has said, no, we don't have that reason anymore. And he's come to join the Mother Church as well. So my wife and 5 children and I moved back to near where we grew up in Indiana. We wanted to find a parish that was faithful, Orthodox, boldly Catholic. I thought if I'm leaving so much on this side, I wanted to find one that was very, very intentional about being Catholic, very proud of that. And we found a wonderful parish here in this part of Indiana. And so we went through, this would have been 2015, I left, and then we started RCIA almost immediately. At Easter Vigil, my wife and I and our 5 children all received the sacraments that we were missing, and we entered the church at Easter Vigil 2016. And it's been a wonderful journey, continuing just my love of the Rosary and the teachings of the Church, and especially spending time in front of the Blessed Sacrament. It was something that I looked forward to even before I was able to do that. But to do, a holy hour and just know that Jesus is present, that's been a very powerful thing for me. It's something that, sadly, there's so many tools that our Protestant brothers and sisters don't have. Our Lady, the intercession of the saints, the time spent in the presence of the Blessed Eucharist. It's just I've really enjoyed all these, and it helped me tremendously. These tools, these gifts that are given to us in the Catholic Church.
Thank you for watching this episode of Don't You Know? And let's do the logic. If you found this topic meaningful, don't forget to like, comment, and share with someone who needs clarity in faith. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next deep dive into truth and theology. Together, let's keep asking, thinking, and believing. with logic and love. See you in the next episode.